The topic today is cultural responses to atrocity. Some of you may have been at Professor Tansman's earlier lecture today. That is our topic, and he will begin today making a short statement. Then each of the panelists will respond in 5 to 7 minutes. We have 1 hour, and we're trying to get responses from all the panelists, allow them to respond to each other, and take questions from the audience. So somehow we're going to do that in the next 57 minutes. So we'll invite Professor Tansman to make some introductory remarks, and then we'll proceed in the following order. We'll first hear from Professor Ilona Klein from the Department of French and Italian, followed by Professor Aaron Scablin from History, then Professor Stephen Reep from Asian and Near Eastern Languages, Professor Mike Murdock from History, and finally Professor Kent Schull from History. And at that point, then, we'll invite the panelists to dialogue among themselves. Professor Tansman.
Thank you all for coming. Can I ask how many people were not here this morning? This morning I talked just to give you a sense of what happened, and not to spend too much time because time goes very quickly. And I'm really interested in hearing everyone else's responses to the material this morning. I didn't give a scholarly talk. I talked about a class that I've been teaching for a few years with other teachers and by myself on Japanese and Jewish responses to atrocity. Mostly World War II, mostly the Holocaust and the bombing of Hiroshima, but not just those two events of violence. And the class also uses sometimes German material, like the literature of Sebald, quite wonderful German writer who's recently been translated. This last year I taught it with an anthropologist of Africa, and we dealt with the Sierra Leone and other places in Africa. So I'm a literary scholar, and part of the point of the class is to deal with how artists, but not just artists, writers, journalists, photographers, filmmakers, and then regular people represent their experiences of traumatic events of violence within specific historical contexts. So the class is really not a history class. It's really a class about representations of violence and also of suffering. So that means it involves talking about literary form. It means talking about what happened, that is history. It means talking about religious traditions, aesthetic traditions, psychological traditions, trying to understand if there's a psychoanalytic way of mourning as opposed to, let's say, a Buddhist way of mourning. And if anything can be said about the category of culture, that is, do Japanese or have Japanese express their suffering differently than have European Jews? It's this last question which I wanted to talk about a tiny bit because I think it's the one that's most uncomfortable for me personally, even though I'm the person who set up the class. Because I have found in teaching the class 5 or 6 times that what I've learned most is that the category of culture is the most difficult one to hold on to. That is that each individual's responses to violence and then each individual's representation of that response, whether it be in a personal memoir or a poem or a novel or a photograph or a film or whatever, is so complex and has so many factors feeding it that it's very, 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 very hard to say in the end, has to do with this person being Japanese. This has to do with the person being Jewish. There are certain cases in which one can make those claims more strongly. When you're reading the response of a religious Jew who's using biblical narratives like Lamentations to try to understand their personal experience, you can say this person is very deeply informed by a specific religious and cultural tradition. But I'm also dealing a lot with people who are secular, who are informed, for example, by the biblical tradition, but in a more secular way, for the kind of stories it tells, not because of the religious content of it. You also, there's a complicating factor here that the Japanese that I've been trying to understand are not people who are unexposed to Western philosophy and literature. Indeed, many of them were as exposed to Western philosophy and literature and culture as were some of the people I study on the other side, on the Jewish European side. So these divides are very thin and porous. So the influences on an individual are incredibly complex. And then, as I mentioned this morning, there are other factors that I think can't be left out of this. And this is what may make this endeavor a humanities endeavor, perhaps, and not a social science endeavor. Other factors that are hard, that are impossible to quantify, I think, and even hard to analyze, that have to do with an individual's temperament, family upbringing, personality, things like that. There are cases where we know where people went into concentration camps completely secular and came out religious, something that I, as a secular person, find quite amazing. I believe it. I just can't quite fully imagine it. But there are cases where the opposite happened, where religious people lost their faith. So this, what I'm saying now, leads me to raise another question or problem maybe for us to talk about, and that's the question of empathy. Because a lot of the class, and if you were there this morning, you saw this, involved showing students materials that really demand that they react emotionally. And very, very difficult stuff to look at and difficult stuff to read. So they react very strongly emotionally, and I want them to react emotionally, but I also want them to analyze intellectually. And I don't want them to get so lost in the emotion that they lose their capacity to think. And that can happen. The worst case of that is a student I once had who argued in his final paper that I think he was arguing that the people who lived downwind from certain nuclear tests in some part of Utah in the 50s suffered as much as the Jews in the concentration camps, and that all suffering is the same, and that you can't make distinctions. This kind of to my mind, ethical sloppiness led me to want to never teach the class again. So that's one really bad downside to bringing in emotion to the classroom. At the same time, I don't think any of this material can adequately be dealt with, and this has to do with our disciplines, I guess, social scientifically. I think one has to account for emotion, and in dealing with aesthetic material, particularly literature, film, whatever, that material is trying to work on our hearts as well as our minds. And this doesn't go just for this kind of class. For any literature classroom, in my opinion, has to deal with both of these levels. That is, how does it make you feel in your gut? And then, why does it do it? How does it do it formally? Now, when you bring those questions to representations of violence, if you have a conscience, you feel a little bit ethically disturbed, because as we did this morning, some of you were there this morning though, right? Yeah. As we did this morning, we looked at a photograph of suffering people, and then I asked people, and people probably did it without me asking them, to step back and think about the image in formal terms. Why is there light here? Why is there shade here? Why is there rhythm here? So you do this enough, and you can turn into a really cold-hearted intellectual, where you're looking at scenes of terrible suffering and you're becoming really cerebrally analytical. And that's a problem. So kind of finding one's way between those two things and holding on to emotion, and then I would say intellect and also history, is really, really important, and is threatened by the very setup of the class. Just two other brief things, and I know this is scattered, but I think it might raise some points that came up this morning and may come up from my colleagues here. There's the question of memory versus history, that is, of what's private and what's public, and how private memory comes to have authority over public memory or vice versa, is, I think, something worth talking about, and I know people on this panel have thought about it a lot. And each one taken to an extreme has its pitfalls. And then maybe finally, I'll say just briefly, it's kind of an obvious point, the mismatch of comparing Japanese and Jewish responses to violence, having to do with the fact that the Jews of Europe were not in any way victimizers. They were not enemy combatants. They were not in a war with the Nazis. They were really, they were victims, pure and simple. The Japanese citizens who were killed on the home front may not have been soldiers, but they were in a state, and they were victims as well, but they were in a state that was at war. So it's a mismatch in that way. It's not a parallel. And one thing that's interesting to me in the Japanese case is how people and how a nation of knowing that they were victimizers, and we know that the Japanese government doesn't want everyone to know that, or doesn't believe it themselves. How does that work if you know you're a victimizer and you've also been a victim? This is a very fascinating and complicated case, which is true of the German cases, and why I urge you, if you're interested in this, to read the works of Sebald, S-E-B-A-L-D, because you learn through him and other German writers that so many decades were spent by the Germans understanding, apologizing for, and really dealing incredibly well, I think, with the Nazi past, that there wasn't space or time or a public sphere to deal with themselves as victims, which many of them were, specifically in the air raids. So there's a growing literature in translation now from German to English, air raid literature of Germans who suffered. And it's complicated because you're in a nation in which you've been told that you're the victimizers, and now you're trying to eke out a space for yourself to talk about yourself as a victim. In this last iteration of the class, I said we dealt with Sierra Leone. That made me think that the whole model of comparison itself is a big problem, because the more cases you bring into this, the more complicated it gets and the more varied the factors become in trying to understand any one situation. And then at the end of that term, which was last term, I really thought, why do this? Where does this lead to? I mean, what's the point pedagogically for students? That's the audience for this, really. And the only thing I would say there, and I'll end with this, is that once in a while there's a student who actually feels motivated to do something in the world because of this material. And most teachers, well, I include myself, we do something, but we don't do, I guess we do something in the world, but we don't do something in the world in the way I mean it right now. I mean, some of them are motivated to go out and do human rights work of some sort, if not abroad, then within the local community. And if that happens, I think there's something quite important being done here. If it doesn't happen, I wonder what the important goals are. Empathy, perhaps, sensitivity to other people's suffering. But to be cynical, that doesn't seem to have helped the world all that much. And on that really dark note, I think I'll stop.
Do we go up to the microphone? Just from the table. Just from where we are. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Is the mic set okay? I'm going to take 5 minutes, and my answers will be also scattered, mostly just throwing there some ideas. In fact, I am completely in agreement that human suffering cannot be compared. Each of these genocides has its own parameters. In the case of the Jewish genocide, it was the own government of German Jews or Polish Jews who decided systematically to annihilate them in the camps. And as far as comparing of sufferings go, in the past probably 20 years, there has always also been a new research model on the second generation of the survivors. So there's almost this competition now between the actual victims who survived the concentration camps and the legacy, the psychological legacy in their children, and how they are raised and what difficulties they find. Elie Wiesel, who is the Peace Nobel Prize 1987, himself a camp survivor, he was a 14-year-old Ashkenazi Jew, repeatedly writes in his essays that the contrary of love is not hatred, the contrary of love is indifference. And in the case of the Jewish Shoah, the Holocaust, the Shoah more properly, it is not that everybody was anti-Semite as much that the huge majority of the people were indifferent and did not act and take a stand against this kind of human stereotyping and human scapegoating that was going on at that time. What kind of reactions are there? Oh, a myriad reactions. I can start thinking about museums that have to do with the Shoah, the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, which is probably the most important Holocaust museum in the world. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., maybe from about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I'm not sure. The birth of the State of Israel. Teaching. We are responsible for teaching what happens, to try to make some kind of a reason and logic to, in fact, a period in history that has absolutely no connection, no logic, no reasons for happening. We try to teach through novels, at least I do, through poetry, through autobiographies, especially through documentaries, through films, because we're also in a cultural moment in which the repository, now that the survivors are slowly dying out, becomes a repository of media, and we have false films, we have films that are commercialized, we have films that are just plainly not true, and a lot of people are exposed to facts of the Shoah through these untruthfulness. I'm thinking specifically about the film Life is Beautiful by Benigni that even won an Oscar and is probably one of the most false films that was ever created. In my syllabus, I teach a course on the Shoah here at BYU. I've done it at an undergraduate level, at a graduate level, both with the Department of French and Italian, with Complet Department. I'm currently teaching it in an honors course. I try first to go through the history. There's a historical compendium just to see, in fact, what happened, and together with that, we use Rabbi Kurtzner's textbook, What is a Jew? Because of course, most of my students are LDS and may not be familiar with the huge variety and classifications of what is a Jew, a secular Jew, an ethnic Jew, a cultural Jew, a religious Jew, of course. We then go into the politics of eugenics and the disabled. This is a minority within a minority that has not really been talked about within the atrocities of the Shoah. Certainly the Jehovah Witnesses, the homosexuals, the Roma, the Gypsies, yes, the Roma, the disabled. These are minorities that we still are not able to study correctly. We go through a short segment on the mechanics of death, on how the Nazis purposefully created the gas chambers and the crematoria so they could be more efficient, if that is a correct word to use. And I do believe, I completely agree with Professor Tansman, that when you approach topics of human atrocity, the scholarship is different. It cannot be an isolated intellectual scholarship. There has to be a heart part, a compassion part, a human part that embeds within the intellectual research. I try to use mostly autobiographies as first-hand literature because I believe that my students can understand and empathize, in fact, better. We read Primo Levi, a Sephardic Jew, a chemist. We read Elie Wiesel, I've mentioned him. We try to bring in the voices of the children of the Shoah. We work on the book of drawings from the Terenzin concentration camp. We work on pseudoscience. We're just, in fact, finishing now the autobiography of Miklos Mishli, who is a Hungarian Jew physician forced by Dr. Mengele to participate in the pseudoscientific atrocities of Auschwitz in order to try to survive, and in fact he did. I try to debunk the idea of Jews going to the gas chambers like sheep going through the slaughter. I try to emphasize the kind of resistance that went on, either physical resistance or intellectual resistance, the possibility of being able to deny the consents. The crux then at the end of the semester, actually the two cruxes at the end of the semester are, one, the issue of forgiveness. Because I work at BYU in a Christian LDS environment, the Jewish perspective on forgiveness is very different from the Christian perspective on forgiveness. What do you do with these atrocities? Can you forgive? Do you forgive? How do you forgive if you do? What is the Jewish point of view? What is the Christian, specifically Mormon point of view on this huge theological topic? And then the last week is devoted to where do we go from here? Why do I teach this class? What is the catharsis of the class? I don't believe in just exposing my students to a semester of absolutely horrifying facts that can in fact continue. We have Darfur, we have the Hutus and the Tutsis. We have the killing fields in Cambodia. We have Rwanda. We did not learn with 6 million Jews who were killed in the Second World War. So what do we do with this? And to pick up on what Professor Tanzman was saying, again, I remind my students this happened because people were indifferent to the genocide. None of us can change the world by ourselves, but each of us has to find one or two causes true and dear to our hearts. It can go from helping homeless people to volunteering to disabled vets to helping stray cats and dogs to the spotted owl in the Northwest. It's whatever cause my students feel that their heart is screaming because there is a wrong that has not been made right. And we end the semester on trying to say, how can we assume not collective guilt, we are not guilty for what happens, we were not there, but collective responsibility as human beings, and make sure that indifference does not create some kind of a parallel situation again.
Thank you, Professor Chaplin.
Sorry. I appreciate this opportunity to respond to Alan, and also I'd like to respond to Ilana as well. There's a lot that I've learned from reading Alan's paper and listening to his presentation, and it got me thinking about my own teaching. One of my primary teaching responsibilities is to teach world history, modern world history, History 202. And I'm still trying to figure that class out, as my students know. But one of the things that one of my goals in the class is to create kind of empathy and kind of greater sensitivity within my students. For an understanding of that I think is key to an understanding of history, and from the comments now, I realize that that's something that needs to be valued. But if it ends at that, then it's probably just empathetic indifference. So I last semester I had a couple of students who seemed as if they were on their way to graduate work in history, and I took great pride in that. But I think that if I would even take greater pride if students went on and whatever direction they took in their life, if they took action that was a response to, hopefully, the empathy and the sympathy and sensitivity that they acquired through their liberal arts education at BYU. But Alan's presentation as a literary scholar got me to thinking about the differences between history and literature. And particularly, I think this is the case for many of my colleagues in history. Many of us draw on literary works, on novels, on short stories in our classes, and we often do so in order to tell the story of the victims, of those who have been colonized, imperialized. And when I say victims, it's the story of, usually the story of survivors of these atrocities and other events. And I thought it got me thinking about that historians, I think, are fairly good at analyzing the victimizers, the imperializers, the colonizers, those who are creating these situations. But I think part of the reason that we draw on novels and short stories and memoirs and oral histories is that I think there may be I think historians, perhaps because of our training, because we, to an extent, although we think of ourselves as in the humanities, we're in some ways trained as social scientists, that we're not equipped with the skills to adequately tell the stories of those who are victims and survivors, and those who have been imperialized and colonized. And I don't know if that is valid or not, but it's something that I would like to throw out. I think there's something to be said for the power of fiction and these sources that we usually tap into. And I'd like somebody actually to prove me wrong, so I can take greater pride in my discipline. But I'll leave my comments there.
There's nowhere to put your knees under here, which is why I keep knocking my knees here. I'd like to thank Alan for his very thought-provoking paper. I think it's a very important topic. It's a topic, interestingly enough, that I've been working on peripherally, and I see some students in the audience, and so some of the works that I mentioned today may be familiar to them. The tale of atrocity from the Chinese point of view, if we begin with the bomb at Hiroshima, we're beginning a tale in media res. That is, we're beginning a tale that's already being kind of in the middle of happening. It hasn't really begun. For the Chinese, it begins with the Second Sino-Japanese War. And Alan has hinted at that, and I'd like to kind of look at how different authors have tried to explore that particular event, both writers in the PRC and also writers in Taiwan. The responses are quite complex, and they differ significantly. Ironically, for both the governments of the PRC and the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, the exile government in Taiwan, those atrocities were kind of co-opted and adopted into these heroic narratives of idealized soldiers fighting either against the Japanese for the gradual building up of a country that would become the PRC, or in somehow were conflated with the communist enemy by the Republican government in Taiwan and kind of minimized and marginalized, so that in a sense I don't know that writers had a chance or readers had a chance to use literature in some of these very politicized writings to work through atrocity. And so that creates a very complex type of situation. Benedict Anderson has written in his book, Imagine Communities, that the nations that win get the luxury of revisiting history and rewriting it from their perspective, writing it, as he puts it, I think, up time. And that's what happened in the PRC in the 1950s. There's an effort made to go back and revisit history, first the Civil War from 46 to 49, the most recent atrocity, then back to the Second Sino-Japanese War from 37 to 45, or in the term used in Japanese history, the 15 Years' War, which goes back to the period of Japanese aggression that goes back actually to 1931. In these contexts, in these cases, the effort was made to revisit these events and reconstruct stories that cast the Japanese as evil villains. In the Civil War, it was the nationalists. As they moved back, they got to the Japanese, then they go back further and get to Western imperialism. But we'll put that aside for today, even though we probably should talk about it. There isn't enough time. Suffice it to say that these stories were wonderful if you, in a kind of an ideal sort of way. Ironically enough, in Taiwan, something similar happened, except because in Taiwan, the major trauma was the loss of the homeland and the mainland. The major issue wasn't the Japanese, it was the communists. And so most of the writing that takes place in Taiwan in the 50s looks back on the communists. When they get back to the War of Resistance, they tend to conflate the Japanese enemy and the communist enemy, even though in theory the nationalists and the communists were aligned, and again kind of demonize them together. Well, the beginning of the 1960s in Taiwan and in the 90s in China, as political liberalizations allowed it, writers explored these events again in ways that were anti-heroic. And to touch on a point that I believe Ilona raised, which is they focused on the personal and the individual rather than the national. And I think this was vital to try and recover these moments of atrocity in a way that people could use them in Taiwan or in China. That's not to say that they got it all right. My first example is by a very well-known PRC writer, Yu Hua, whose film To Live, I think, is being screened. Is it this week still? I think it's still being screened this week, and I recommend you see it. He has a short story called Iga Tiju Desu, The Death of a Landlord, which focuses on how the landlord's son, and this son is absolutely profligate, he's an utter disaster morally, but he becomes the hero of the story because when a group of Japanese troops coming by on a mop-up campaign ask him to take him to the next town that they're going to, he basically takes them out to the middle of an island in a freezing lake. And as he goes by, he tells the peasants in the local dialect to tear down the bridges. So he basically leads himself into a position where he and the Japanese troops are now, are going to die one way or the other. They kill him, so he dies quite quickly, and assumably they die of starvation or some other such thing. The story tends to demonize the Japanese, and that part hasn't changed that much. And if you're asking me why, I think it's because in the literature of the 50s that preceded it, the Japanese were very much consistently demonized. And Yu Hua retains that aspect. The enemy is the enemy. And I think this is a reflection of this. It's also a reflection of kind of lingering issues in China, particularly the textbook controversies, issues of comfort women that have not been dealt with. And the Japanese government, as Alan hinted, hasn't really, from the Chinese perspective at least, owned up to that. And that, I think, that anger resides. But there's a lack of resolution there. In the Taiwan case, and I'm just going to cite one case because my time is really pretty much up, the poet Ya Xian is a naval officer who writes poetry with a group of his colleagues in the late 50s and early 60s. Interestingly enough, he writes when he talks about war, it's always anti-war poetry, in spite of the fact that he was fighting for the Navy. He was conscripted in the late 40s and came to Taiwan, leaving his family as part of the Navy. And so that may explain to a good extent why he was anti-war. But what I think distinguishes his poetry is the fact that he writes poetry about bombings in Naples and Florence, in Italy, as well as in China. He never focuses on the enemy, because I don't think for him the enemy is any particular force. It's the whole institution of war. And I think the thing that I find most refreshing about Ya Xian's attempts to write poetry is to see war for what it is and for the atrocities it creates. There are no winners or losers in war. We all lose to one extent or another in many cases. Certainly when we look at things from the point of view of atrocity. His poems focus primarily on civilians, women and children almost exclusively, with soldiers and combatants limited largely to those who are disabled in war. And the message that comes out of it is a message that's very much personalized. It's universalized in the sense that war is not seen as something which is Chinese versus Japanese. It's seen as something that could be Chinese, Italian, European in general. And I think that, at least for me, maybe that's a point of entry where we move from the public and national memory to the private and personal memory, which is used to somehow kind of take apart this national kind of agenda that's put to war. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Steve, for covering history for me so I don't have to. Well done. I, too, would like to applaud Alan Tansman's humane and ethically minded attempt to understand atrocity. It shows a particular sensitivity, humility, and appreciation, even as it attempts to eliminate painful portions of history. To me, as a historian, this is the heart and soul of the discipline and indeed the task of a historian. It's at the core of what we do. The wrenching experience of exploring human suffering purges us of our own pettiness. It commits us to the struggle to prevent further atrocities in the future and enhances our capacity to empathize with victims. In every case, breaking through comfort zones and embracing someone less fortunate than us makes us better, what we here at BYU would call more Christ-like. And I think that's absolutely vital to a liberal education, to what you guys do in literature to what we do as history faculty. The point that I would like to draw out is that unfortunately this pure and noble task is often adulterated by outside interests. It is complex. I study China, and as Steve has indicated, the study of atrocity has become very politicized there, largely because memory and even the definition of terms are shaped by the regime. In fact, culture is shaped and steered by the regime in extreme cases. Atrocity, or the term 残难 in Chinese, appears only when the regime allows it to exist, allows a particular event to be designated as an atrocity. Atrocity occurs only by the hand of the other, never by one's own side. Incidents that victimize the enemy are victories, triumphs, successes, whereas incidents that victimize one of our own are identified as atrocities. In other words, the term atrocity is often used as a club to bludgeon one's rivals. Steve has indicated how designating communists or Japanese or nationalists as the enemy, and therefore the perpetrators of atrocities, exists all throughout history. And every generation has to redefine who these enemies are, and therefore atrocities themselves get redefined, remembered, and therefore reanalyzed. Most recently, Chinese authorities, Chinese businessmen even, have used the term to weaken the hand of Japanese negotiators in table talks, whether it's related to business or policy. Another recent example is the Tiananmen Square massacres of students, which has not been designated as an atrocity. In fact, it's not remembered at all. It's just been swept under the rug and has seemed to disappear from recent history. Unfortunately, this is not a phenomenon unique to China, here in the United States as well. Decision makers can denounce certain voices and strip them of their significance. National identities, especially the heroic narrative that Steve talked about, or the official memory, the official version of history, has a very difficult time dealing with atrocities when perpetrated by your own side. It can handle them perfectly fine if you're the victim, but if you're the perpetrator, they tend to be redefined or ignored entirely. Schools often ban films and books that depict an atrocity, deeming these materials offensive. But when the term offensive is used, it often doesn't mean offensive to us as human beings. What the term actually refers to is offensive to the dominant identity, offensive to the power structure that exists, offensive to the way that we perceive ourselves, that we create and shape our communities, the way that we remember our past. Atrocity, when we talk about it in terms of the Holocaust, in general terms, makes Americans feel good about themselves because they view themselves as the liberators, the endors of this terrible experience, forgetting what we did to the Jews before the liberation of the camps. When we use the term in conjunction with Hiroshima, however, it tends to put Americans back on their heels because it makes them feel somewhat responsible or guilty. Same thing could be said about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, treatment of people who have been incarcerated at Guantanamo, issues in Iraq or Afghanistan even today. In the best case, redefined or victims made insignificant, in the worst case, ignored entirely. That's natural, it's normal, it can't be avoided. Every identity attempts to glorify good deeds and sanitize less happy ones. My point here is that the study of atrocity is added, with all the complexities that Alan talks about and Steve talks about, it's even more difficult because of this politicization phenomenon. There is always somebody who will seek to exploit the term atrocity for their own purposes. Victims suffer no matter what happens. That's unchangeable. But some are granted the right to express their voice, to be recognized as victims of atrocity, while others remain entirely voiceless because authorities prefer to bleach out their experience from our collective memory. Even at BYU, just to bring things closer to home, a child who is born in a brothel in a small Indian village is not allowed to voice her opinion here at BYU because such films have been banned. The film Black Rain by Shohei, which depicts victims of the Hiroshima bombing, have also been taken off the list of appropriate material because they are deemed, quote, offensive by certain administrators. All of this is done in the name of eliminating offense and unpleasantry and in the name of protecting students, but at what cost? What do we lose when we selectively allow the term atrocity to be applied in one case and not another? Even worse, what do we miss when we refuse to allow certain voices to be heard because we find them offensive or we find their story offensive? For his courage in tackling these issues and creating a chance where students can tenderly encounter victims and listen to their stories, listen to their experiences, and not try to strip out of that experience itself the emotional content that's necessary. I applaud Alan Tansman, and I hope that we here at BYU can learn from this experience. Thank you.
In an attempt to wrap things up, I guess in some ways from at least my, with my thoughts, I first of all want to add my accolades to Professor Tansman's very nuanced, self-reflective, careful, and carefully discussed, and most importantly, self-reflective in terms of how atrocity needs to be dealt with, looked at the plight of the victim, and also the discussion regarding the perpetrators as well. My area of research and study deals with the modern Middle East. And specifically what I research are two different areas, dealing with World War I and the end of the Ottoman Empire, which entailed what is generally accepted as the first genocide of the 20th century, perpetrated against Armenians, and also the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, and the rise of vehement and perverse ethnic nationalism that pervades the Middle East today. The problems with looking at how Professor Tansman is approached the Holocaust and Japanese recollections of atrocity and how they are interpreted by us and how we deal with them, it doesn't speak to issues where you have victims on both sides of the conflict. Particularly when you have the two conflicts that I study have mutual victims. And unfortunately, in this day of vehement nationalism and ethnic nationalism, if you discuss one side or the other's victimhood, for some reason, the other side feels that their victimhood has been minimized and has been deteriorated and undercut. And that is an important issue that we have to look at and see if we can get around somehow as historians, as academics, as human beings, can we get these issues of atrocity, these issues of genocide, these issues of victimhood out of a nationalist agenda and look at them as human beings first and foremost. That's this empathy that we have to look at. Because in the conflicts that I study, there are in many cases, victims are perpetrators as well, and perpetrators are victims. And how do we study, analyze, look at, give voice to all of these individuals without minimizing the victimhood of the others, of those on the variety of sides? Regarding the Armenian genocide and the massacres that took place against Turks and Kurds, it's a very heated topic that is caught up in nationalist rhetoric on both sides. And it's important to look at it in terms of, look at the stories of personal stories where there are Armenians who were protecting Turks and Kurds from being massacred, where there were Turks and Kurds who were protecting Armenians from being massacred. We have to look at and discuss and understand it in its complexity. We have to be very careful also in how we use the term genocide, to define its context, to what extent, etc., in order to prevent the inaccurate representations and comparisons that we've discussed here. Note, every genocide is unique. Historical events are unique in themselves, and we have to be very careful how we compare these things. Are any genocides comparable? or any atrocities comparable? That's the question that we've been trying to look at here. But when we use the term genocide to label atrocities, immediately the Holocaust or Rwanda or something comes to mind, and this gives an inaccurate comparison or portrayal of other genocides and the unique circumstances of which they occurred. And we have to be very careful of that. What I want to put out again is, how do we use what Professor Tansman has been looking at, and can we apply it to an area where there's in a conflict where there's perpetrators and victims, they can be one and the same, where there's victims on both sides. And that goes with the issues of Germany, when it was being discussed, of the Bonn, the bombings of Bonn, the fire bombings where many people were slaughtered who were civilians. And what does this issue mean when we use the term innocent victim as opposed to victim? What are we saying? And what does that mean? And how is a victim being portrayed? We have to be careful with what we look at in terms of this issue as well. Victimhood seems to be generally displayed as feminine or child or infantile. And we have to be careful to understand and not just classify it as that. And be careful not to fall into those traps as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks to our panelists. We have about 12 minutes left. I want to give the first opportunity to respond to Professor Tansman if he has some remarks he'd like to make. And let's take some questions.
Maybe only briefly, because I think people want to talk from the audience. One thing I would add to an earlier comment about states politicizing memory. One's identity as a victim can also be a form of politicization. And I was thinking of the Japanese. This is important to keep in mind in the Japanese case, in which the sense of being a victim, if not the victims, trumping even the Jews. And O.A. Kenzaburo, the Japanese writer, wrote about this, that we are the most victimized of the victims because we represent the people who are the first stage in the possible destruction of the world. So there's kind of this queasy victim, this queasy competition over who got it worse. That did allow for a certain kind of amnesia about the Japanese as victimizers. And this is not, in this case, necessarily from an authoritarian right-wing government. This is from a leftist anti-nuclear political movement. What I'm saying now is it's much more complex than this, that there was some recognition of Japanese victimizers. But being just the victim allows one to efface one's status as a victimizer, which ties up to your final comments there. And by those final comments, there's a really fascinating book called The Machete Season, which is about the Hutu and the Tutsis. And it follows 8 kids who lived in a village and a soccer team. And they were Hutus and Tutsis who played together. And it follows how in the course of just weeks, they split up and how friends were macheteing their friends by the dozens every day. And how each group was a victim and a victimizer. And it's not an analytical book, it's a descriptive book that it's in some ways this goes to the question of form and how we deal with this in social science and humanities. In its thick description by a journalist, it says something more deep, more profound about these things than many books of analysis. So I would just recommend that and then open things up. It's called The Machete Season, and I forgot the author's name. But Google it.
Thanks. Rather than, not that the panelists don't have other things to say, because I'm sure you do, but we do want to take some questions from the audience. So please, let's turn to the audience.
I have a question about this morning's discussion, in that when you were asking questions about the images you were showing, and some of the times you were asking them in terms of how is this beautiful and what is beautiful about the painting, or can you classify it as beautiful? And I'm wondering if maybe a different way to talk about it would be to talk about in terms of the sublime. And the sublime would suggest the depth of emotion, or representations of the sublime.
Right.
I think Agamben characterizes the Holocaust in those terms. I'm wondering how you feel about that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Part of the exercise there has to do with your comments about social science and history, both of your comments, and that is the need in certain matters. And I'm heartened to hear that at the heart of history is the same heart as at the heart of literary study. That to get at certain things, you have to deal with, hard facts on the ground, experience, and creative representation of experience. And sometimes it requires separating each out in order to bring them back together again. So formally analyzing a photograph and then going back to the hard case of it and then putting the two together. The thing about the sublime, which I find a little dangerous, is that sublime is used to designate something beyond the capacity of the mind to imagine and to experience and to represent. And that is used a lot to talk about Hiroshima and the Holocaust and other events. And I have come to believe that that category, or describing these events as undescribable, has more to do with the processing of the events than with anything more objective than that. Because in a certain sense, and I don't mean to compare this to the drinking of water, but it's probably just as hard to describe in writing what it feels like to quench your thirst. I mean, that's also in a certain sense not describable. So that category, which sometimes the sublime is used for, sometimes allows for obfuscation, or allows us to then just not to analyze. And this goes to an earlier point too, that if the Holocaust, for example, is beyond historical description, that's a frightening thing, actually, because there's a history to it, right? And if by calling something a genocide, you're saying it's beyond understanding, that's also a frightening thing, because then you're giving up your capacity to understand and maybe correct or at least be vigilant. So that's why I have a slightly worried response to the use of the sublime.
Yeah, I just thought in aesthetic terms it might be a different way of talking about
it. Is, and
beauty, or something like that.
And it's a good way because
to the students.
It's a good way. It's especially good because people within the event use that, right? Yeah, so that's a good point. Thank you.
Thanks. Back.
Given our modern context of historical revisionism, those who say the Holocaust or the Schull never happened, why do you choose to use a text, fragments, that is falsified versus a Primo Levi or an Elie Wiesel, which can still extract an emotional response yet is historically accurate?
Thank you. It's not a choice, actually. The course is 15 weeks, and we do use Primo Levi. We don't use Elie Wiesel. We do read a lot of Primo Levi. I use the fragments in about the 13th week, by which time, I assume this happens even before the course begins, but certainly by the 13th week, this is not a question anymore, that this event is open, that this event happened. Holocaust denial is not on the table as a legitimate historical exercise. So I wanted people to experience this book, which hundreds of thousands of people around the world experienced as real, and then had the rug pulled out from under them, because it's a phenomenon about the culture of suffering, and it's a phenomenon about the modern world, in which, maybe not just the modern world, in which memory takes on a certain kind of status, and then when it's somebody's memory and the claim is for authentic memory, and it seems right, and it seems fragmented in just the right ways, you don't question it at all. So the exercise is not meant to make people question the autobiographies that you use, not at all, but it was just to point out that it's a historical lesson. This happened, and it seems important to figure out why, and the abuses to which memory can be put, and also the ways in which historical events can be used for very, very personal reasons, because this kid very consciously mapped his own personal traumas onto what he knew was the most pressing historical issue of his moment.
There was a comment about CPR's cover-up, kind of the Tiananmen Square. And I want to kind of compare that to the United States and the use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and the change of public memory and private memory. Has there been any manipulation there in our country?
One of the purposes of covering up Hiroshima was a larger cover-up, which was to cover up the Japanese atrocities committed against the Chinese. Mm-hmm. And the purpose for that was self-serving, as they always are. But immediately after World War II, the United States wanted a valiant ally in the Asia-Pacific Rim, someplace that we could put bases. Did not want a lot of tension between the Japanese and American servicemen that would be over there. And so all attempts by MacArthur's government to cover up atrocities were designed to convert American people from thinking of the Japanese as animals or barbarians that needed to be extinguished, and move over to thinking of the Japanese now as friends. Conversely, with the Chinese, who had been allied with us during World War II, they were our allies, but now we have to think of them as the enemy because they're communist. So again, it's this politicized manipulation of memory and history. Those documents have not come to light yet, But in some ways, covering up the bombings of Hiroshima and such were part of that larger, do I dare say, plot?
We've got a hand over here.
It's maybe a little too political or maybe even too broad for the discussion we're having, but it seems like we're seeing this situation we're talking about victimizers also being victims and the whole idea of atrocity. Is there some kind of, through your studies, is some kind of underlying principle that we're missing? And Audrey Klein talked about how we haven't learned from what happened with the Holocaust and where 6 million Jews died. We haven't learned because we see it repeating in Western countries. Is there something that we could be doing as far as like students and people who want to be involved? We talked about the things like helping homeless people and like that, the things that can start getting us on that track. But is there some key that we're missing in trying to understand even just the beginning of a process that leads us to being able to more effectively approach these ideas so that we can have political systems or governments as we're voting and choosing representatives in our governments here that can affect that kind of situation where we don't have people who are so manipulated by political systems so that where they can not only be a victim but also be a victimized at the exact same time. Is there things that we should be looking at as far as your own personal opinion, what we should be looking for in our leadership?
I don't know necessarily it's for the leadership, but for yourself, what I think you look at is give voice to the voiceless, listen to the underdog, don't let the status quo write history. Listen to your soul. You are a college student, I assume you read the newspapers, there are always going to be some issues that something in you screams it's wrong, and make sure that you put in your 2 cents to make it right. If everybody does that, we can change the wrongs. If we are complacent about the status quo, we don't. So I always say listen to the underdog.
Anyone else want to dive in on that? Let's take one last question, and I missed a hand somewhere. Please, Eric.
I'll be the next.
Yeah, thanks.
At the risk of being offensive in Mike Murdock's definition of offensive, and then playing off Professor Klein's and Professor Tansman's comments, I agree that the Japanese atrocities, the perpetuation of atrocities in the Holocaust, gross atrocities committed against Jews, are not comparable. But if we change periods of time, we find some comparison. That is, after the creation of the State of Israel, those who were victims become the victimizers, and they occupy the indigenous people's lands, and they suppress the Palestinians, and carry out horrendous atrocities like Deir Yassin and things like this. How do the Jews deal with that, understanding that? I mean, the Jewish historian Benny Morris, in some of his early writings, said, look, we should confront that and realize and admit, face up, that we committed these atrocities, and then we can move forward. That seems to be the Japanese problem. They can't face up to the past so we can move forward. Where the Germans face up to the past, we move forward. So is there some correlation between Jewish people feeling victims and therefore justified in victimizing, and Japanese inability to face up to the past and seeing themselves as the victims and not being able to move forward?
What does that mean, move forward?
Move forward and sort of move beyond this. And of course, in the Middle East, it would mean some kind of peaceful solution between Palestinians and Jews, which hopefully someday would come. Move forward would be some kind of resolution of the conflict between the Japanese and the Chinese, where they can put the past behind them, much like we have put the past behind us and the Japanese and us and the Germans. We don't continue to relive that past. We're able to move forward as allies and friends in a productive way. The Israelis and the Palestinians can't do it. The Japanese and the Chinese and the Koreans can't do it. That's a little bit kind of all over the place, but this passiveness is, I think, the issue, where the world now sits passively as we watch Palestinians incarcerated, victimized, and things like that, and we don't address that issue. So we haven't learned from the past, and we don't move forward.
We have not, oh, I'm sorry.
No, maybe you should address this first. Go ahead.
I don't know this.
No.
No,
This is a very offensive question.
No, it's not an
at all.
offensive question.
It's a difficult
I
question.
find that as Americans, we in fact are not facing our past with what we did with the natives when we invaded the land. I think it's much more complicated. I personally don't believe it's an issue only of Palestinians and Israel. I believe it's an issue of all of the Arab nations and Israel. I think there has to be some kind of an economic convention similar to what's happening in the United States and create a United States of the Middle East. I don't believe that the Palestinian problem is only an Israeli problem. The Palestinian problem is a problem of displaced Arabs from other Arab nations. But to get back to, I think, the crux of your question, if I understood your comment, if I understood it correctly, I also don't believe that Americans have looked at our soul and made our wrongs right before we start looking at what other people are doing.
Can I respond to that?
Once Middle East politics comes up, that's the end of it, you know.
Notice the one Middle East person here.
I think what you're talking about, Eric, is my point. Memory is power.
Yeah, that's right.
And as long as there are issues of contention between two countries, memory will be dragged up no matter how old. You never get over something, you never move forward. It's just convenient to set it aside and bury it in the closet for a moment, drag out as soon as opportunity arises. Look at Yugoslavia. When it split apart, what were the issues that really divided the Serbs 800 years ago? And I think that history, until we realize that and see how it is manipulated by people and then used to reshape identities, rekindle animosities, and generate this hostile nationalism that Ken's talking about, then we will never get a handle on it. We will always be manipulated by it. And referring back to this young man's question about what can we do, educate yourself so you know when you're being manipulated by somebody who says, these are our enemies, they have committed atrocities against us. That's always questionable, that's always debatable. If you're educated enough that you can challenge those, then you're in a decision-making capacity. You are an agent unto yourself, not a wind blowing, or a leaf blowing in the wind.
One of the problems with historians, let me pick on historians for a while.
I got the mic, go ahead.
Historians always want to remind us, press the idea that if you don't remember the past, you're bound to repeat it. My argument is, no, it's the opposite. If you remember the past, you will repeat because you're always dragging back your memory to use it as a cudgel against someone that generations ago offended you. And I honestly live in some fear that as economic systems twist and turn, we can always dredge up an anti-Japanese feeling. You know, some politicians say they skinned us in Pearl Harbor, we're going to get them now. Or the Chinese, you know, really, what, you know.
That's the operative word, though. You just said it.
Well,
Some politician. It's not historians that drag up the past. We know it happened, but it's politicians who manipulate the past.
So maybe we need to forget about
It's your political sciences, Eric.
We need some kind of historical amnesia so we can move forward with a clean slate.
Professor Tansman, did you want me to comment on that?
I don't know. Just a few things. One is I want to defend historians here because the operative here is memory and history. Memory, I think, can do a lot of mischief, but history isn't exactly the same thing as memory. And history is a little more, hopefully, rigorous and unemotional. And so remembering historically may not be the same as remembering emotionally. Also, I would also just add that the situations, the Japanese and the Jewish situation are so different. First of all, Israel is much more living in the present of its past than Japan is. They're still living in a state of violence. And also, American Jewry is not Israeli Jewry. Quite a bit of American Jewry is quite critical of Zionism in its present form. So bringing that case in, it brings in a lot of complicating factors. And historical amnesia can be a healthy thing, and that's why, just to go back to the emotional part, vengeance is one response to these things, forgetting is another. I'm not sure which is healthy emotionally, but they have different political implications. And letting things go can help, but who are we to tell people to let things go?